Welcome back and happy Saturday. We are continuing in our story today of King Saul and the future King David. Where we left off on Wednesday was David was having tons of military successes in King Saul's army. And people were beginning to see of how great a leader he was, and they were singing songs about how great he was. And that didn't sit well with King Saul because King Saul was known as the military man. That's what he put his identity in. And so he started getting really jealous and angry and paranoid towards David. Even though David hadn't done anything to really be like, yes, I am taking over as king now. But King Saul was not very happy with all that David had been doing. And it goes so much to even into our story today that King Saul kind of just lets this fester for a really long time. And this just keeps getting worse and worse of his anger towards David.
Yeah, in the plan of God, Saul had already disobeyed and was no longer king. And what God had now called David to be king. Rather than David just trying to take over things, he still serves under Saul very loyally, very faithfully. So this really, all of this essentially evil that's happening is by King Saul's part. So what happens is that King Saul ends up talking to his men, talking to Jonathan, who is a best friend of David, and saying, we need to kill David. He just needs to die. And so what Jonathan does is that he warns David and says, David, for some reason, my dad, King Saul, wants you dead. So hide for a moment, and I'm going to talk to him to see, well, what's going on here. So David hides, and Jonathan comes to King Saul and says, okay, well, why would David need to die? I mean, he's been very faithful to you. He's been an amazing, loyal general in your army, and there's just no reason for him to have to be killed. So Saul, understands that and says, you know what? As surely as the Lord lives, David is not going to die. Okay, in that moment, it seems like peace happened. David comes back and continues serving Saul, taking the army in order to win victories for the Israelites. But then Saul just changes his mind. And even, multiple times, because of Saul's paranoia, anger, and frustration, it just says that evil spirits came into Saul and took over him and made him do terrible things. So again, Saul is like, we need to kill David. We really need to kill David. And what happens is that then David's wife, Michal, who was King Saul's daughter, warns David and says, you gotta go now because there are men after you from King Saul that are going to try to kill you. So David escapes, and what Michal does is that she puts an idol into the bed of David and puts kind of like this animal hair on top of the head of the idol, and then puts like a blanket over it. And then when the men came, Michal just said like, oh, well, he's sick. He's not available at the moment. Just look, he's right here. Just leave him for a moment. And so when the men came back to Saul, Saul was like, no, wait a second, grab him out of the bed and all that. And when they went back and found that the idol was there, Michal was like, oh, well, I didn't want David to kill me or anything. Please leave me alone. So really, at this moment, there's David is starting to become what is a fugitive towards King Saul. So David, of course, he goes to Samuel, the prophet, the judge who is listening to God, who tells the people of Israel what God wants. He comes to Samuel for help, and Samuel ends up, giving him this protection that really comes from God, where the point is that Saul sends men, and even Saul tries to look for David where Samuel is, and none of them are actually able to find them. Really, they end up being distracted and taken in a completely different direction of what they thought they were going to do, coming towards Samuel. So really what we see throughout this very interesting twist and turns is that it's only King Saul that really wants David dead. And King Saul is really fighting not only against David, but really what is the will of God, in a very bad way. That's essentially destroying himself from the inside by completely focusing on trying to get David, on trying to protect his own position and against the will of God. He is now going more and more into a self-destruction path, which will ultimately end up with the destruction of his whole lineage and kingdom, or his position as king.
So then David's kind of on the run and with the prophet Samuel. And then he flees again and goes to Jonathan. He's like, what have I done? Like, what have I done against your father? Why does he keep trying to kill me? Like, tell me, what have I done? And Jonathan's like, look, you're not going to die. My father, he doesn't do anything without talking to me. So I'll go talk to him. I'll try to smooth things over. If he really does mean to kill you, I'll let you know. And if he doesn't, then it's fine. You can come back to the palace and everything will be great. And so they come up with this kind of a secret code. And they make a pact with this secret code of Jonathan's going to go talk to King Saul. And David's going to go hide outside somewhere in like this kind of like a backyard type area, I guess you would call it. And the plan is that Jonathan's, after talking to King Saul, he's just going to go out, he's going to shoot some arrows, and based on what he says to the servant who goes to gets the servant, that gets the arrows, it's going to be a cue to David of whether or not he's safe. And David's like, cool, that sounds like a good plan to me. We will go ahead and do that. So that next night, Jonathan goes and he's having dinner with King Saul, and they're chatting, and Jonathan's like, so, what about this David guy? And that is enough to set King Saul up into a rage where he like turns violent fast. And Jonathan in that moment realizes that King Saul actually wants to physically kill David. And so Jonathan escapes, and he goes out to this backyard field area where David's hiding, and they stick to their code, and Jonathan gives him the word that, listen, you are not safe, you need to get out of here. But then, so he says that so everybody can hear, oh, that arrow, it's too far from you, so go get it. But then he runs and finds David, and he says, listen, you go now, do not stop. You leave, you go. And so David leaves, and this is the first time we have David fully on the run from the kingdom, with King Saul on basically a warpath trying to hunt him down. And so it becomes this game of cat and mouse in these next couple of chapters of King Saul trying to capture David, and David keeps on running. And even though he has no real reason to run because he hasn't done anything wrong, but King Saul is after him and is going to kill him.
So here we have David, who, again, very loyal towards King Saul, is then supported and protected by the people that God really placed in his life around him. His best friend, his wife, and Samuel. All of these different people that have helped David not to fall into the hands of King Saul. And this is really an important part because that's something that we also need to look to. Having people that have our back, that will protect us, and that will guide us towards what is the path that God wants for us. And the second part is that even though we might be accused of something we may not have done, the important thing is still to do what is right and to follow God, no matter what the circumstances is. Because in all of, at this point, essentially, because of the support that he had from the people, from Jonathan, from all these other ones, um, David shouldn't have had to go through this whole experience. And this was all brought because of the evil desires within the heart of King Saul. But we will see through this story is that really God is the one who has the last word in all that is happening. So even though we might be experiencing things that we shouldn't be doing, we shouldn't be experiencing, that wasn't because of our own fault, it is important it is that we're following and who is the one that we know has control of things, and that it may not get resolved at the moment, but following God is really where we can ultimately do what King David ended up doing, and that is following the heart of God.
Yeah, so we'll continue the story next week, and we'll see you then.
See ya.